In this video, I'll be making my updated 2026 Senate election prediction as of today, August 11th of 2025. Now, as we already know Donald Trump's last 2 years in the presidential office is largely dependent on whether he is able to win the U.S. Senate as well as the U.S. House. If Republicans are able to retain both chambers of the U.S. Congress, then Trump will have a relatively smooth last 2 years in office. However, if Democrats are able to flip either chamber, then Trump would have a tougher 2 years of passing legislation. Now, Republicans currently control 31 seats that are not up for re-election, while Democrats control 34. That being said, Republicans have a fundamental advantage. They lead in the Senate 53-47 as of right now, which means that Democrats need to flip at least 3 seats to get to 50-50. That being said, even if Democrats get to 50 seats, J.D. Vance and the Republicans still hold control of the U.S. Senate, as the vice president, in this case Trump's vice president J.D. Vance, gets to break any tie, which means that for Trump and the Republicans to be realistically threatened, Democrats have to flip 4 seats, which is incredibly difficult, especially because 2026 is not expected to be a huge blue wave year. That being said, even if Democrats can make some gains, that would thwart some of Trump's legislation due to moderate senators like Senator Susan Collins or Lisa Murkowski. But without further ado, let's start filling in the map. As we already see, Republicans have 46 safe seats, while the Democrats only have 40. So I'm going to start off here with Democrats and their likely seats, and honestly, there really isn't that many. First off, in the state of Virginia here, incumbent Democratic Senator Mark Warner should have not that much of a challenge of winning re-election. Warner won by 12.1% in 2020, overrunning Joe Biden by about 2% or so. He is a relatively popular incumbent, he should be able to win re-election. Another relatively popular incumbent that should be able to win re-election. Another relatively popular Democratic incumbent senator is Senator John Hickenlooper of the state of Colorado. He won against Cory Gardner, the incumbent Republican, by over 9 points in 2020. Now, as the incumbent, he should have no challenges of winning re-election. That race is likely Democratic. Now, finally, the last state that is considered likely Democratic is the state of New Mexico. In the state of New Mexico here, Ben Ray Lujan had a relatively disappointing finish back in 2020, winning by just 6.1% against Mark Ronchetti, who made a solid run against, I believe, Democratic Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham in 2022 as well, only losing the race by about 5%. Now, as an incumbent, Lujan should have an easier run, but in 2024 as well on the presidential level, New Mexico was only decided by 6%. Lujan could face a competitive race against a strong challenger, but so far none has emerged, so New Mexico retains its likely Democratic status. Next up, we go to some of the more interesting safe Republican states, as well as some of the likely Republican states here. I'm going to start off here with Nebraska here. It's not going to be really a competitive race. The only reason it's worth mentioning is that Deb Fischer, the Republican incumbent back in 2024, only won the race by 6.7%. This time round, Dan Osborne, the independent, who made this race competitive, will once again be running for this race. The problem now is that he is running against Pete Ricketts, the son of a billionaire who has a lot of fundraising money, who is able to spend a lot on advertisement, and definitely a lot more popular than Deb Fischer, who many consider to be too establishmentarian and frankly too out of touch to the average voter. Therefore, this race here will probably not be competitive, but it is worth mentioning. Another state that is worth mentioning that will not be competitive is the state of Florida, because Marco Rubio decided to join the Trump administration. That left the seat wide open, but in 2026, it's not really expected to be competitive. Republicans appointed a candidate who is expected also to be the Republican nominee in this race, that being Ashley Moody, who already has Trump's endorsement, but there will probably be some entry into this race. That being said, this race is not expected to be, very competitive in any way, and some county officials who are actually Democrats or independents decided to endorse the Republican Party candidate Ashley Moody, so this race really would not be that competitive. Now we go to some of the other races here that would still be considered safe Republican. First off, in the state of Iowa here. Iowa, in my opinion, will be considered safe Republican. It's not a state that I expect to be super competitive. That's because Democrats funded massive amounts of money into that race in 2020 and still lost the race by 6.5%. Democrats thought that Teresa Greenfield, the Democrat, had actually a shot against Joni Ernst as they were head-to-head about equal in some of the polls. That being said, Greenfield ended up losing by 6.5%, overrunning Joe Biden by less than 2%. Joni Ernst is a relatively popular Republican. I do not believe the race will be super competitive, especially when Trump won the state by 13.2%. Another state I do not expect to be super competitive, but nonetheless could be interesting, is the state of Ohio. Sherrod Brown has said that he is interested to run for this race for Ohio and try and reclaim the Senate seat he lost in 2024. There is, however, a problem with that. Sherrod Brown is not the incumbent, and Bernie Moreno was a very weak challenger. Even though Moreno is considered universally to be very weak, very out of touch according to many independents, he still won with the majority of the vote and by 3.6 percentage points. Sherrod Brown still lost, and now Sherrod Brown, as a non-incumbent, facing a stronger Republican nominee, will probably lose by at least double that margin, if not more. Overall, I would consider this state about a Republican plus 8 if Sherrod Brown runs, and probably a Republican plus 12 if Sherrod Brown doesn't. Since I predict that Sherrod Brown would end up withdrawing, I do believe this race would end up being just on the cusp of safe Republican. Now we go to two of the likely Republican races. One of them could easily be safe, the other could easily be more competitive. The more safe state, in my opinion, would be the state of Texas, where the general election is not as interesting as the Republican primary. In the Republican primary there, Ken Paxton, the Attorney General, who was actually impeached before and now running for U.S. Senate, is leading in most of the polls, if not in all of them. In fact, he has an advantage in all of these polls. The question here is, though, whether he would end up actually getting over 50% of the vote in the first round of voting. That is because John Cornyn right now, although he is definitely trailing, and by double digits, if not by close to 20% in some of these polls, such as this one showing Paxton up 19, and this one showing Cornyn up 22, the question is whether Ken Paxton can go over 50%. If he is below 50% due to other candidates or write-in candidates, that means that this race would go to a runoff, which would further complicate things for the Republican Party. That being said, Ken Paxton is easily the favored, and it would be hard for John Cornyn to win this race, especially because Cornyn's name ID and Ken Paxton is pretty similar, so I don't believe a lot of voters would end up changing their mind, saying that one candidate is suddenly not their preferred choice. John Cornyn's advantage is that he has a lot of money. We're talking about him having over $5.9 million cash on hand against Ken Paxton at $2.5 million. That being said, the fundraising doesn't really make that much of a difference. However, if there was another Republican nominee, let's say Wesley Hunt, you could see that this race would probably most likely go into a runoff. A runoff would be more interesting. That being said, I would have to say that Ken Paxton is probably the favorite to win the Republican nomination. Paxton is probably slightly less popular in this race compared to John Cornyn as in the general election, but it doesn't really matter when Trump won the state by 13.7%. Realistically, Cornyn could win by closer to 15. I think that Ken Paxton probably wins by 10. It does depend on who the Democratic nominee is. Right now, it looks like it could be Colin Allred or it could be Beto O'Rourke. In 2018, Beto O'Rourke was a pretty strong candidate. He only lost the race by about 2% against Ted Cruz, but Ted Cruz is Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is not someone who's very popular. Not to mention that Beto O'Rourke was far more popular at the time. He was pro-gun, now he isn't anymore, and now he's too far left. So that race would easily be likely Republican under Ken Paxton, and probably safe Republican under the incumbent John Cornyn. Now we go to the state of Maine here. And the state of Maine could be more competitive according to some pundits, but I have to say it's likely Republican. The reason is fairly simple. Back in 2020, Sarah Gideon, the Democratic nominee, outraised Susan Collins, the Republican, by like a 5-1 or 10-1 margin. It was a very significant fundraising gap. Even Republicans were kind of crossing their fingers, thinking that Collins was gonna lose, but hoping a miracle would happen and that Sarah Gideon would somehow lose by the skin of her teeth. Instead, Susan Collins wasn't even forced into ranked choice voting and ended up crossing over 50% of the vote. Ranked choice voting does make it more interesting because then some of the more progressive vote would have shifted to Sarah Gideon, but then it would still have definitely not been enough, as Collins won 51% of the vote in the first round. This was certainly a shock to a lot of voters, but if you look at the historical context, it's definitely not surprising, as Susan Collins won by 37% back in 2014, but more polarized environments has made this race a lot more competitive. If you look at even before that, for example, there was another senator in the state, I believe. I actually forgot her full name. Yeah, Olympia Snowe. She was even more popular than Susan Collins. So the state definitely has a history of voting Republican, at least on some degree on the Senate record. I just do not believe that Susan Collins will now face a very strong challenger after a disappointing finish for the Democratic Party in 2020. I really think that Democrats, even with a 5-1 or 10-1 advantage in fundraising, was not able to beat Susan Collins. I really don't know what it would take, and thus I would have to say that this race is likely Republican, unless a very strong Democrat joins, then maybe it's lead Republican. Anyways, it's not that competitive of a race. Now we go to the state of Minnesota, which I would have to classify as lead Democratic. I want to start off here with the state of Michigan. In the state of Michigan, incumbent Senator Gary Peters is not seeking I believe, a third term in the United States Senate. Now, Peters actually had a fight for his life in 2020. He underran Joe Biden. Most people expected him to overrun Joe Biden, and Biden was expected to win the state by 6 to 8%, which meant that he was going to win by like 8 to 10%. Instead, he won by 1.7. He underran Biden and nearly lost to John James, who Republicans effectively gave up on. John James is now a representative in Macomb County, in and around a Macomb County district in the state of Michigan. Anyhow, he's not running for re-election, and this race is wide open. It's unclear who Democrats are going to run in that seat as of right now. There are a few candidates that have been speculated to end up running. There's Haley Stevens, a representative, Abdul El-Sayed, a very progressive candidate, Malloy McCrow, who's somewhere in between, and Joe Tate, who I have no idea who he is. Anyways, it doesn't seem as though there's a clear candidate who is dominating, albeit Haley Stevens seemed to be the favored. We don't really know what's going to happen. Haley Stevens is an okay candidate, but she doesn't necessarily outran candidates on the presidential level by a lot, and she's only well known in her district, as her own polling suggests. Abdul El-Sayed is definitely too progressive, and it does definitely seem like that she would not be able to win. Gretchen Whitmer would be a decent Democratic candidate, but she's not going to run. Now, in the general election polling here, let's see. So, Haley Stevens seems to be the favored. Abdul El-Sayed definitely doesn't look like he has much of a chance. Malloy McCrow looks like Mike Rogers is the favored. Republicans will probably run Mike Rogers. Here's a problem, though, with Haley Stevens and the Democratic Party in general. I think Stevens will win the primary. That gives the Democrats the best shot. The reason it's not looking super good for the Democratic Party is that, realistically, Haley Stevens has more name recognition than Mike Rogers, who sure was a Senate candidate in 2024, but number one, Republicans kind of gave up on Mike Rogers because it didn't seem like that he was going to defeat Elisa Slotkin, the Democratic candidate, and B, he is a former representative and someone who left politics several years ago. He doesn't necessarily have charisma, and yet Mike Rogers is down by at most 6%, and in most of these polls, he's either down by 1 to 2%, or in this one outlier, he's up by 6%. So it does seem clear that this race is a lot more competitive than people think, and this is not a good outlook for the Democratic Party. Not to mention that contentious primary could be bad for Democrats, because if Haley Stevens gets kind of like a split primary, where she gets like 30% of vote, and the progressive gets 30%, I'm sure most progressives will still vote for Haley Stevens, but even if a few, for example in Detroit and Ann Arbor, stays home, that's bad news for Democrats, when Michigan's a state that they need to squeeze out every vote from. That is why I would actually go ahead and give Michigan to the Republican Party. Now we go to the state of North Carolina. North Carolina, I believe in my previous prediction, I had this going to the Democratic Party. But now, similar to the state of Michigan, I kind of have a change in mind. Here's why. We look at the state of North Carolina here, and we see that the incumbent Senator Thom Tillis is retiring because he was going to lose the primary. Now it seems like on the Republican side here, Thom Tillis withdrew, of course. It seems like Michael Whatley, who has the President Trump's endorsement, will probably win the Republican primary. Now, if you look at the Democratic Party here, it does seem more likely than not that it's going to be Roy Cooper, the Democratic former governor of the state of North Carolina, as the Democratic nominee. Here's the problem, though, I have with Roy Cooper. Cooper is supposedly very popular, but he isn't as popular as people say he is. Polls in 2020, I believe, had him winning this governor's race by like 60%, and he won by 4. 4 is respectable for a Democrat in a swing state, but not so much when people think you're going to win by 16, as you're the incumbent, and your opponent kind of gave up on campaigning in the first place. 4% is not that significant. And Michael Whatley, like half of the people in the state probably have no idea who that is. Polls consistently show that Michael Whatley has a name ID recognition rate of below 50%, while Roy Cooper has it over 90%. The fact that this race is still so competitive kind of shows that Michael Whatley is not actually in a bad position, and the fact is Roy Cooper is not at 50% in any of the polls. Well, that suggests that, in my opinion, I actually believe that Michael Whatley is favored. I think that Roy Cooper consistently gets overestimated in the polls, not to mention that the polling isn't even that favorable for him, given the name ID issue. As of right now, I would have to give North Carolina here to the Republican Party by less than 1%, similarly to the state of Michigan. Finally, now we go to the state of Georgia, where incumbent Jon Ossoff is facing a Republican candidate who we don't know so far. If this was Brian Kemp, it should be an easy win here for Brian Kemp, at least comparatively. However, it's still not clear who the Republican nominee is, and it looks like it's certainly not going to be Brian Kemp. Right now, it could be Mike Collins, a U.S. representative, who actually I think got third place in the 2020 general election in the state of Georgia before it got forced in a runoff, giving Raphael Warnock that seat. In my opinion, I think that was Doug Collins. Right now, the Republican candidate could be between several candidates, including Buddy Carter, a representative, Mike Collins, a representative, and, some other potential candidates here. So far, it's definitely not clear who's going to end up running. I believe Derek Jolley is a candidate that Brian Kemp actually wants to run because of the fact that he is considered someone who's, who Brian Kemp likes and thinks is more moderate and perhaps could end up winning. Here's the thing, though. It's really not clear who the Republicans are going to run, and right now it looks like it's more likely than not going to be a bloody primary fight where each candidate does well in their own districts and there's no party consensus, while Jon Ossoff can kind of just run his campaign. The reason that's bad for the Republicans is that when Republicans are trying to win the primary, Democrats can already focus on the general election. And unlike in the state of North Carolina here, Jon Ossoff holds a more consistent lead. Against Buddy Carter, he's up by about 5% in general. Against Mike Collins, it's definitely closer in some of these polls here, but he also consistently has a lead. And it does seem like that Mike Collins at least has a higher name recognition than John Whatley, who is the presumptive, or at least likely Republican candidate in the state of North Carolina. Not to mention that Jon Ossoff actually has the incumbent advantage, and Ossoff is a relatively popular incumbent. I just see that there's too much needed for the Republicans to overcome that, given that it is going to be a year where the Republican president is having to defend a midterm. I do still think that Georgia would go Democratic. So overall, Republicans at 54 seats, Democrats at 46. What does that mean? It means that Republicans now have one more crucial vote compared to what they do before, which means that Trump will have even more ability to pass bills, depending, of course, still on what happens in the United States House of Representatives. Now, as of right now, this is, in my opinion, the most likely result. That being said, if Trump has 2 rough years, and by midterms he has a 30-something% approval rating, then we could see Michigan and North Carolina flip. If on the other side of the house we see that there's somehow Trump ends up having a plus 10 type of advantage in terms of the approval rating, we could see that the state of Georgia ends up going to the Republican Party, and even Michigan, even Minnesota and New Hampshire goes to the Republican Party, in which case Republicans would have probably unchecked power in the United States Senate, and Republicans would just dominate in this U.S. Senate in decades to come. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.